The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 was one of the most significant finds in biblical studies ever. But along with those ancient writings was another scroll, made of copper and written in code. It contains a list of over 60 locations in ancient Palestine where treasure had been hidden. Estimates of its value range from the millions to the billions in today's dollars.
Although this would make a great plot for another Indiana Jones movie, it's even more exciting than that because it's true. Today on Totally Awesome History, the Copper Scroll and the treasures of the temple.
While the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the caves of ancient Qumran by Bedouin shepherds in 1947 and subsequently brought to the attention of the world through antiquities dealers, only a few years later, archaeologists began searching the 40 other nearby caves, finding scrolls and fragments of them in 11 of the caves. In the third cave they searched, however, they found one that was stunningly unlike any of the other scrolls, both in content and material. They found the Copper Scroll.
The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves consist of some of the oldest surviving manuscripts we have of the Old Testament, with the exception of the Book of Esther. The oldest manuscript dates as far back as 300 BC, while the youngest dates to approximately a generation before Qumran was destroyed by the Romans in 68 AD.
The majority scholarly consensus is that they were written and stored there by a sect of Jewish purists known as the Essenes, who made their home away from Jerusalem there. One of the reasons for this is because the scrolls also have non-biblical documents among them that describe the strict rules and communal way of life practiced by them, despite the word Essene never appearing in any of the scrolls. The Copper Scroll, however, is not written in language like the others. Some have seen it as resembling a form of Hebrew hundreds of years older, while others have seen it as a form called Mishnaic Hebrew, which rose to prominence in the 1st century AD. Around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD at the hands of the Romans. More recent analysis, however, suggests that the language of the Copper Scroll lay somewhere in the middle, between late Biblical Hebrew and Mishnaic. In other words, from sometime between 200 BC and the 1st century AD.
This throws some cold water on any theory that states that the treasure was buried just before Qumran was destroyed by the Romans in 68 AD and the temple was destroyed by them in 70 AD. Had this been the case, it stands to reason that the Copper Scroll itself would have been written exclusively in Mishnaic. Another problem is that we don't know what some of the words actually mean. This is because many of them don't appear in the Bible or anywhere else for that matter, presumably because the Copper Scroll is describing an inventory and isn't a narrative like the Bible.
Likewise, although the hiding places seem to be concentrated near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, near Jericho, and the wilderness around Qumran, the specific locations it mentions are difficult to identify because the place names have obviously changed in the last 2,000 years. It also contains a large number of Greek loanwords and mysterious Greek letters placed randomly throughout, as if it were part of a code. To add even more mystery to it, the pattern of clauses in its writing style bears a precise resemblance to Greek temple inventories from the island of Delos. These records date from 180 to 90 BC and were compiled by priests at the Delian Temple of Apollo.
For the most part, each entry follows a similar format. It starts off by giving a general location, followed by a more specific one, then how far to dig, and finally what one would find if they dug there.
In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps, with the entrance at the east, a distance of 40 cubits, a strongbox of silver and its vessels, 17 talents by weight.
Even more curiously, the final treasure mentions a second scroll that explains the one we have, a key, as it were, to cracking the code.
In the dry well that is at the north of Kolit, with an opening on the north and graves by its mouth, a copy of this inventory list, with explanations and measurements in full detail for each and every hidden item.
Trouble is, no one's found it, or any of the treasures for that matter. So what are we to make of this in the meantime? Why does a group of Jewish Puritans living in the Judean desert, assuming they were the ones who wrote the Copper Scroll, rely so heavily on Greek loanwords, style, and letters? To understand this, we need to look at the enormous impact that the Greek way of life and worldview known as Hellenism had at the time.
After Alexander the Great, Hellenism became and would remain all the rage in the ancient world, and Palestine was no exception. Greek essentially became the common tongue, and even the books of the New Testament were originally written in it. The Hebrew Bible was also translated into Greek from the 3rd through the 2nd century BC, and this translation was known as the Septuagint. It was this version of the Old Testament that was used by the early church, and is still used by Orthodox Christians and Catholics today. Greek influence was everywhere. Greek ideas, Greek furniture, Greek business, architecture, art, fashions, and institutions. A great many Jews also began taking Greek names and educating their children in Greek thought and philosophy. Some have even suggested that the notion of an afterlife was only adopted by the Jews in the mid-2nd century BC as a result of Greek influence. Prior to that, death was final. There was only Sheol, the pit of nothingness. Enter Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Seleucid king of the Hellenistic Syrian kingdom. The Seleucid Empire being one of the 4 kingdoms established after the breakup of Alexander the Great's territory after his death.
Antiochus decided that it was high time that he fully Hellenized the Jews. He started by installing one of his own underlings as temple high priest in 175 BC. This was a bold move because ever since its beginnings around 1000 BC, the position of temple high priest had belonged to a descendant of Zadok, King David's very own chief priest.
Eventually, members of the Zadokite line became known as the Sadducees, the conservative, aristocratic, and priestly class so often railed against by Jesus in the New Testament. Needless to say, they were not impressed by Antiochus's move. Then, in 169 BC, he went so far as to set up a statue of Zeus in the Jewish temple. He also outlawed the Sabbath and circumcision, and even began having pigs sacrificed in the temple. Anyone who resisted and their children were rewarded with brutal deaths. This led to a revolt led by a priest named Matthias and his sons Judas Maccabeus, the Hammer, Jonathan, and Simon. They were able to recapture Jerusalem in 165 BC, and it is this victory that came to be commemorated in Hanukkah. Incidentally, the book of Daniel was written during this time, according to some, as a means of propaganda. The Maccabees, as they were called, became known as the Hasmoneans, and were quickly established as the new hereditary rulers of Palestine.
But there was one problem. No sooner had the Hasmoneans come to power than they adopted with gusto the very Greekness that they had fought against.
They began minting coins in both Hebrew and Greek, hiring Greek mercenaries and strengthening ties with both Rome and Antiochus' son. What was worse, in 152 BC, instead of naming a Zadokite to the role of high priest, Jonathan named himself. In this way, he would have access to all the riches of the temple treasury, into which Jews from all over the Mediterranean made contributions. Essentially, he would have become the most powerful Jew in the world. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. A number of traditional Jews would have none of it, and under the leadership of a member of the Zadokite succession, left for Qumran, and allegedly became the Essenes. Of course, such an act in itself bore the stamp of Greekness. Traditional Judaism placed a heavy emphasis on duty to one's family and community, so to abandon them to go and live in a sort of desert commune of purists had, until that time, been unheard of in the Jewish world.
All of this to say that the culture of Palestine was so soaked in Hellenism at the time that it makes perfect sense that the Copper Scroll would bear as many Greek elements as it does.
In leaving, the Essenes may have taken some of the temple treasures with them, along with some of the scrolls we find as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Could these treasures have been part of the many listed in the Copper Scroll? Certainly, a great many of the items listed are related to priestly vestments, sacred vessels, and other artifacts related to the priesthood. Items that any self-respecting purist or Zadokite would be interested in hanging on to.
Additionally, since they believed the temple at Jerusalem had been defiled by the Hasmoneans,
it makes sense that any taxes or tithes that they would have collected would have been kept by them and perhaps even become part of the inventory treasure on the copper scroll to be recovered once things were set aright in Jerusalem. That the copper scroll was most likely written in the 1st or 2nd century BC is only further corroborated when we remember the resemblance that it bears to the temple inventories of Apollo at Delos. Some have suggested that the copper scroll and the treasures listed on it are nothing more than an ancient hoax, but this is incredibly unlikely.
Why would anyone go to all the trouble of recording this list on copper only to pull a prank on people in the future that they would never meet? The punchline is lost even more when one considers the specific nature of some of the locations it lists. In the cave of the old washer's chamber on the 3rd terrace, 65 ingots of gold. One gets the impression that whoever wrote it had an audience in mind who would have had inside knowledge of where these landmarks were. There is also the curious case of the Emek HaMelech, a collection of Kabbalistic writings scribed by a 17th century rabbi and published in Amsterdam in 1648. Titled The Vessels of the Temple, it describes how 5 great saints hid the treasure of the first Jewish temple before Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II in 587 BC, and the temple was destroyed a year later. What's more, it says that Shimor the Levite and his companions wrote them on a copper tablet, and they concealed them for that day when Israel shall return to its former estate and receive honor and everlasting acclaim. When there is made known to them a man, David, son of David is his name, and the silver and gold will be revealed to him when all Israel is gathered together to go up en masse to Jerusalem. If this is the same copper scroll as the one found at Qumran, could the reference to it in the Émile HaMelech be a memory of a real treasure from the Second Temple in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC? Thus far, all attempts at finding any of the treasure have proven fruitless. While it's entirely possible some of it has been found, the odds that all of it has been found seems unlikely, since the copper scroll was presumably never recovered to lead anyone to all of its 60-plus locations. This makes the copper scroll one of the most compelling and mysterious treasure maps in history.
Today, the copper scroll continues to intrigue those who know about it. And with so many questions and so few answers, it quickens the pulse and promises us a treasure hunt of the ages. It also causes us to question what more could be out there. And for these reasons, the copper scroll and the treasures of the temple are part of totally awesome history.